May 1948. A British demolition team stands before the last Tiger tank in a German scrapyard. 3 years ago, this machine was the most feared weapon on any battlefield. Now it's scheduled for destruction. The sergeant raises his hand. Explosives detonate. The turret flies 30 feet hit into the air and crashes beside the hull with a thunderous impact that echoes across the empty depot. In 3 years, 1-800 Tigers had been reduced to fewer than a dozen survivors scattered across the Allied world. This wasn't battlefield loss. This was systematic elimination. And by the time anyone realized what was being destroyed, it was already too late to save them. One engineer who tested Tigers at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland later said, "We were so focused on defeating them, we never stopped to think we might be destroying the only examples future generations would ever see." This is the story of what happened to the Tiger tank after Nazi Germany fell. It's a story of trophy hunting, Cold War rivalry, industrial-scale destruction, and the desperate race to save the last survivors before they disappeared forever. Of the 1,837 Tigers produced during World War II, fewer than 10 complete examples exist today. What you're about to hear explains why the most iconic tank in history nearly became extinct, and how a handful of machines survived against impossible odds. May 8th, 1940, Germany's unconditional surrender takes effect at midnight. Across Europe, the Panzerwaffe has ceased to exist as a fighting force. Tigerwurst and Tiger II tanks stand immobilized from Normandy to Czechoslovakia, victims of fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and overwhelming Allied firepower. By that morning, the strategic landscape had transformed completely. Weapons that had terrorized Allied tank crews for 3 years were now abandoned wrecks or intact prizes waiting to be claimed. The question facing Allied commanders wasn't how to defeat Tigers anymore. It was what to do with the hundreds that remained. The variety of conditions surprised Allied tank officers arriving at German positions. Some Tigers appeared nearly pristine, preserved by units that had surrendered intact. At testing grounds like Kummersdorf near Berlin, investigators found Tigers in various states of completion, alongside technical documents, spare parts inventories, and training manuals that revealed the sophisticated logistics required to keep these machines operational. Others showed catastrophic damage from internal demolitions. German tank crews, determined to deny their vehicles to the enemy, had detonated explosive charges inside turrets. The results were devastating. Turrets blown completely off hulls, breech blocks destroyed, optical equipment shattered, entire fighting compartments rendered unusable. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hartmann, a Tiger commander with Schwer Panzerabteilung 5-3, was one of the men who made that decision. In an interview decades later, he described the moment. "We had fought in that Tiger from Kursk to Hungary, 2 years. My crew and I had survived when so many others hadn't. When the fuel ran out in Austria and we received orders to surrender, my gunner asked if we should destroy her. I looked at that machine, our home, our protection, our weapon, and I couldn't do it. I told the Americans where to find her intact. Maybe I was a traitor to my orders, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy something that had kept us alive." Hartmann's Tiger was one of the few that survived with its crew's cooperation. Most German tank crews followed orders, demolishing their vehicles to prevent Allied use. But some, like Hartmann, couldn't destroy machines they had lived in and fought from for months or years. These acts of preservation, whether from sentiment or exhaustion, meant that some tigers survived in remarkably good condition. Many bore the scars of their final battles. Penetrated armor where 76 or 85 millimeter rounds had finally punched through. Track damage from mines, engine fires from Molotov cocktails, the marks of desperate infantry attacks that had succeeded where tank guns failed. In Bavaria, American forces discovered tigers at the Henschel factory facilities in Kassel. Production had ceased months earlier, but partially completed hulls remained on assembly lines. Engineers marveled at the precision machining visible in unfinished components. Every part revealed the quality control that made tigers formidable, but also made them expensive and time-consuming to produce. In northern Germany and Austria, British units encountered abandoned heavy tank battalions. Entire formations had simply run out of fuel in the war's chaotic final weeks. Tigers sat beside roads in perfect mechanical condition, their Maybach HL-230 engines silent, their 88mm guns still loaded. Their crews vanished into the flood of surrendering Wehrmacht personnel. On the Eastern Front, Soviet armies overran Tiger positions in Silesia, East Prussia, and Czechoslovakia. Soviet trophy brigades moved with systematic efficiency, marking valuable equipment for immediate seizure and shipment to testing grounds near Kubinka outside Moscow. Unlike fighters or bombers that could be flown away, Tigers presented an immediate logistical nightmare. Each Tiger I weighed 57 tons. The Tiger II, known to the Allies as the King Tiger, weighed 70 tons. Moving them required specialized equipment, heavy recovery vehicles, or rail transport through a railway system devastated by years of Allied bombing. The Allied Control Commission established strict protocols within days of surrender. All German armored vehicles were to be immobilized immediately. Weapons disabled, fuel supplies drained, guards posted to prevent souvenir hunters from stripping valuable components or intelligence documents. A debate quickly emerged within Allied commands. Some argued that Tigers should be destroyed immediately as symbols of German military power. Others recognized their intelligence value, the armor composition that had defeated Allied tank guns, the optical systems that gave German gunners deadly accuracy, the legendary AMK and Colt 43 guns that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was impossible. What became clear in those first weeks after surrender was that the Tiger's legend would outlast the tank itself. Even as Allied engineers began the systematic process of understanding and then eliminating these machines, the mythology grew. And that mythology would determine which Tigers survived and which would be lost forever. The Americans moved first and moved fast. American armored units had encountered Tigers in North Africa, Italy, and France, always with respect and often with heavy losses. The psychological impact of facing an opponent you couldn't reliably kill had scarred tank crews across multiple theaters. Intelligence teams from the Ordnance Department spread across the American occupation zones in Germany and Austria, locating intact examples for evaluation. Their mission was clear: understand why Tigers were so difficult to defeat, and determine whether American tank design needed to change in response to what they had learned. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, engineers prepared facilities to receive captured German armor. Aberdeen was America's primary testing facility for military vehicles, a sprawling complex where every weapon system underwent rigorous evaluations before entering service. One of the first Tigers shipped to America came from North Africa. Captured during the Tunisian campaign in 1940, it had been studied briefly in theater before being sent across the Atlantic. By war's end, additional examples arrived from Europe, including a late production Tiger II that represented the pinnacle of German heavy tank development. Captain James Morrison, an ordnance officer at Aberdeen, later described the first time he saw a Tiger Y up close. "I'd seen photographs and intelligence reports, but nothing prepared you for the reality. It was massive. The armor was incredibly thick. The gun looked like it belonged on a battleship, not a tank. And you could see the quality of German manufacturing in every detail. These weren't crude weapons rushed into production. They were precision instruments designed to kill our tanks, and they were very good at it." American tests focused on armor penetration, the fundamental question that every Allied tanker wanted answered. What could kill a Tiger, and at what range? Engineers set up captured Tiger hulls at measured distances from American guns. They fired 70mm rounds from standard Sherman tanks. They fired 76mm rounds from upgraded Shermans. They fired 90mm rounds from the new M26 Pershing heavy tank. The results confirmed what tankers already knew, but the data was still sobering. The Tiger Y's frontal armor was 100mm thick on the hull and 120mm on the turret, sloped at angles that increased effective thickness. The 75mm gun equipped on most Sherman tanks could not reliably penetrate a Tiger's front plate at any combat range. Even at point-blank range, the 7-motor struggled. Morrison supervised the testing personally. He recalled one particular day. "We fired a 75mm round from a Sherman at 500 yards. Direct hit on the Tiger's frontal plate. The round bounced off and tumbled across the test range. The German armor didn't even crack. Then we fired a 90mm from the Pershing. That one went through. That's when I understood why our tank crews were terrified. They'd been fighting with weapons that couldn't hurt what they were shooting at." The 76mm performed better, but still couldn't guarantee penetration beyond 500 yards. Only the 90mm gun on the M26 Pershing could confidently engage Tigers frontally at combat ranges beyond 1,000 yards. This explained the Sherman's horrific loss rates when facing Tigers in Normandy. American tankers had been fighting with inadequate weapons against a superior opponent. Aberdeen engineers also tested Tiger armor against American tank destroyer guns. The 76 on the M18 Hellcat showed similar limitations to the Sherman's 76 meters, but the 90 limits on the M36 Jackson proved highly effective, vindicating the American decision to prioritize tank destroyer development when their medium tanks couldn't compete with German heavies. Tests weren't limited to penetration. Engineers measured the Tiger's mobility, surprised to find that despite its weight, the advanced steering system and wide tracks gave it respectable cross-country performance. They evaluated the Maybach HL230 engine, documenting its power output, 60 horsepower, but also its enormous fuel consumption of roughly 1 gallon per mile under combat conditions. The optical systems impressed American evaluators. German range-finding equipment and gun sights, particularly the TZF-9B telescopic sight, were superior to American equivalents. This gave Tiger gunners the ability to engage targets accurately at extreme ranges. Combined with the 80mm gun's velocity and penetrating power, Tigers were deadly at distances where Allied tanks were still trying to identify targets. Morrison supervised endurance tests, running captured Tigers until components failed. The data was revealing and troubling. Tigers were mechanically complex. The overlapping road wheel system that provided excellent ride quality was prone to mud and ice accumulation. In Russian winter conditions, mud froze between the wheels overnight, immobilizing the tank until crews spent hours chipping away ice. Transmission failures were common. The Tiger's transmission had to handle enormous torque from the engine while steering a 57-ton vehicle. Early Tigers experienced frequent breakdowns. Later, production models showed improvements, but the fundamental problem remained. The Tiger was heavy, and every component operated under tremendous stress. By late 1940, Aberdeen had accumulated enough data to write comprehensive reports on Tiger capabilities and vulnerabilities. These reports influenced the next generation of American tank design. The Amish patent and later the M incorporated lessons learned from studying Tigers. Heavier armor, more powerful guns, improved fire control systems, and recognition that future tank warfare would demand vehicles capable of defeating heavy armor at range. But for the Tigers at Aberdeen, their usefulness was ending. Once tests were complete, they became targets for further gunnery practice or candidates for scrapping. America needed to move forward with its own designs. Captured enemy equipment was useful for study, but had no place in the post-war military. By 1947, most of the Tigers that had been shipped to Aberdeen were destroyed, their lessons incorporated into American doctrine and their metal recycled. The British had their own painful history with Tigers. From the first encounter in Tunisia through the battles in Normandy, British tank crews had learned to fear the 88mm gun that could destroy their Cromwells and Churchills at ranges where they couldn't effectively return fire. At the School of Tank Technology in Chertsey and at the testing grounds at Lulworth, British engineers conducted extensive trials on captured examples. Their approach differed from the Americans. While Aberdeen focused primarily on ballistics and armor penetration, British tests examined the Tiger as a complete system. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Carver, who would later become Field Marshal Lord Carver, supervised some of the early British evaluations. His team disassembled engines, transmissions, and suspension units, documenting every aspect of the sophisticated engineering that made Tigers formidable but also mechanically complex. British reports noted the interleaved road wheel system's strengths and weaknesses. The system distributed weight effectively and provided excellent ride quality over rough terrain. Tank crews reported that Tigers were surprisingly comfortable compared to British tanks, but the complexity created maintenance nightmares. Changing an inner road wheel required removing multiple outer wheels first, a process that could take hours, even with experienced crews and proper tools. They documented the Maybach HLT engine's impressive power output, 60 horsepower for the Tiger 1, 700 for the Tiger 2. But they also calculated the logistics burden. A Tiger consumed roughly twice as much fuel as a Sherman per mile traveled. A heavy tank battalion required a supply train that few armies could maintain under combat conditions. At Bovington, a Tiger Corps captured in Tunisia became the centerpiece of British evaluation. Designated as Tiger 131, this vehicle had been knocked out by Churchill tanks during the North African campaign. British recovery teams had repaired it and shipped it to England for detailed study. Test drivers noted the tank's surprising maneuverability for its size. The Tiger's steering system was advanced for its era, using a hydraulically assisted system that made the vehicle relatively easy to drive compared to earlier German tanks. Drivers reported that despite the weight, a Tiger could pivot nearly in place and navigate tight spaces that seemed impossible for such a massive machine. Gunners praised the optical quality of German sights. The TZEF-9B telescopic sight used in the Tiger 1 was exceptionally clear and well designed. British gunners who fired the 88mm gun reported excellent accuracy at ranges beyond 2,000 yards. The gun's high velocity meant flat trajectory and minimal drop, making range estimation less critical than in Allied tanks, where shell drop affected accuracy significantly. However, British reports also highlighted reliability concerns that reinforced American findings. The complexity of field repairs troubled British logisticians. A damaged Tiger required specialized tools, trained technicians, and specific spare parts. In combat conditions, mechanical breakdowns often meant abandonment because recovery and repair were impractical. The British also evaluated the Tiger II, which represented significant advances over the Tiger I's. The Tiger II's armor was even thicker, 100 mm on the frontal hull, 100 mm on the turret front. The longer 80 mm KJ-43 Elpif-1 gun had even greater penetrating power. British tests showed that nothing in the Allied arsenal could reliably penetrate a Tiger II's frontal armor except at very close range. But the Tiger II's weight, 70 tons, created even worse mechanical problems. The transmission borrowed from the Tiger washed design was inadequate for the increased mass. Failures were frequent. Mobility suffered. British observers noted that Tiger II units often had more tanks broken down than operational, a death sentence in mobile warfare. Carver himself reflected years later. The Tiger represented a philosophy of tank design fundamentally different from ours. The Germans built a few superb machines. We built thousands of adequate ones. Their approach created weapons that were individually superior. Ours created armies that were collectively unstoppable. History proved which philosophy won wars. By 1940s, British testing was complete. The lessons learned influenced future British tank development, particularly the Centurion, which incorporated heavier armor and more powerful guns while maintaining the mechanical reliability that Tigers lacked. The Centurion would go on to become one of the most successful tank designs of the Cold War era, serving in armies worldwide for decades. For the Tigers in British custody, most faced the same fate as their American counterparts: systematic destruction or scrapping. But Tiger 131 at Bovington survived, preserved first for training purposes and later as a museum piece. Decades later, it would become the only operational Tiger I in the world, lovingly restored and occasionally demonstrated for historians and enthusiasts. The Soviet Union had faced more Tigers than any other Allied power. From the Battle of Kursk in 1943 to the final assault on Berlin in 1940, Soviet tank armies had fought desperate battles against German heavy tank battalions. The experience had been traumatic. Soviet WW2 tanks couldn't penetrate Tiger armor frontally. Soviet crews learned to attack from the sides or rear, accepting horrific losses to close within effective range. Soviet trophy brigades moved systematically across occupied Germany and Eastern Europe after victory, seizing every Tiger they could find. Intact examples were priority targets. Stalin himself took interest in German heavy tank development, demanding that Soviet engineers study every aspect of Tiger design to incorporate lessons into new Soviet projects. At testing grounds near Kubinka outside Moscow, engineers subjected captured Tigers to exhaustive evaluation. Soviet testing was thorough and ruthless. They fired captured German guns at Tigers to understand vulnerabilities. They tested Soviet 85mm and 2mm against Tiger armor at various ranges and angles, determining the most effective engagement tactics for Soviet tank crews. The results were sobering but valuable. The 85mm gun on the T-34-85 could penetrate Tiger side armor at reasonable combat ranges, but struggled against frontal armor except at close range. The 100mm gun on new tank destroyers was more effective. The massive 122mm gun on the IS-2 heavy tank could defeat Tiger armor at most combat ranges, though its slow rate of fire remained a disadvantage. Soviet engineers were particularly interested in German optical systems and fire control equipment. Soviet tank sights were adequate but inferior to German equivalents. The precision manufacturing and optical quality visible in Tiger equipment influenced Soviet efforts to improve their own systems. Marshal Georgy Zhukov visited Kubinka in late 1945 to observe Tiger demonstrations. Officers briefed him on German tactics, showing how Tiger units used their range advantage to engage Soviet tanks before Soviet guns were effective. Zhukov reportedly said, "We defeated them with numbers and courage. But we should study how they built these machines. Our tankers deserve better than dying because our equipment was inferior." The Soviets also captured Tigers in unusual circumstances that provided unique intelligence. In Prague, they found examples that had been undergoing repair or modification at Czech facilities. Complete maintenance records revealed typical breakdown rates, spare parts consumption, and the enormous logistical burden Tiger units represented. In Silesia, entire training facilities fell intact, complete with Tigers used for crew instruction and documentation of German training methods. Some of these machines were restored to running condition and briefly used for propaganda purposes. Soviet newsreel footage showed Red Army tank crews operating captured Tigers through Moscow in victory parades, demonstrating Soviet mastery over German technology. Stalin understood the psychological value. Every captured German superweapon helped legitimize Soviet sacrifice and suffering during the Great Patriotic War. Soviet designers incorporated specific lessons from Tiger study into new projects like the IS-3 and T-10 heavy tanks. The emphasis on heavy frontal armor, powerful guns, and sloped armor visible in late-war Soviet designs reflected direct influence from studying German heavy tanks. Soviet engineers admired German manufacturing quality while noting that Soviet designs prioritized reliability and ease of production over precision. Competition emerged among the Allies for the rarest examples. Everyone wanted late production Tiger IIs, which represented the pinnacle of German heavy tank design. Soviet forces were particularly aggressive in seizing advanced equipment in their occupation zones before Western allies could access it. The race reflected growing tensions that would define the Cold War. By 1947, Soviet evaluation was largely complete. The knowledge gained influenced a generation of Soviet armor development, but for the hundreds of Tigers in Soviet custody, most faced destruction. Economic pressures drove the decision. Post-war reconstruction required massive amounts of metal. Tigers represented thousands of tons of high-quality steel that could be melted down and repurposed. The Soviets preserved more examples than Western allies, partly due to their larger capture numbers, and partly due to Stalin's interest in maintaining trophy collections that demonstrated its Soviet victory. Museums in Moscow and Leningrad received examples for public exhibition. But even in the Soviet Union, the vast majority of captured Tigers were scrapped by AIM-50. By late 1948, the intelligence-gathering phase was transitioning to elimination. The Allied Control Council issued clear directives. Germany could not retain any armored fighting vehicles. The Tigers that had been preserved for testing represented only a tiny fraction of those that survived the war. The rest, scattered across Europe in various states of repair, were marked for systematic destruction. The process varied by location and by the condition of each tank. In Germany itself, disposal sites were established at former military bases and training grounds. Tigers deemed worthless for testing were destroyed using methods that ranged from practical to theatrical. Some were used as targets for Allied gunnery practice. This served dual purposes. It disposed of unwanted equipment while allowing tank crews to train against the armor they might face in future conflicts. At ranges across Germany, Tigers absorbed thousands of rounds from Allied guns. Engineers documented which weapons were effective at which ranges, adding to the data collected at formal testing facilities. Others were broken up for scrap metal. Cutting crews with acetylene torches systematically dismantled hulls and turrets, reducing Tigers to sections small enough for transport to steel mills. The thick armor that had protected German crews now made destruction laborious. A single Tiger could take days to cut apart. At Bergen-Hohn in northern Germany, British forces assembled a collection of German armor for systematic destruction. Tigers sat alongside Panthers, self-propelled guns, and other vehicles. Engineers studied the most efficient methods for rendering tanks unusable. They removed guns and breech blocks. They drained all fluids. They disabled engines by removing critical components or simply by smashing them with sledgehammers. For tanks that remained structurally intact after initial dismantling, explosives provided a more dramatic solution. Demolition teams placed charges inside turrets. The resulting explosions were spectacular, blowing turrets dozens of feet into the air. The twisted wreckage that remained served as a permanent reminder that these machines would never fight again. Sergeant William Harrison, a British demolition specialist, supervised the destruction of numerous Tigers in 1946 and 1947. Years later, he recalled, "We were just following orders. Blow them up, cut them up, make sure they're useless. Nobody told us these things might be valuable someday. We were destroying the enemy's weapons. That's what war is about." It wasn't until the 1970s that I saw a Tiger in a museum and thought, Christ, I destroyed dozens of those. Should we have saved more? Probably. But hindsight is easy. In 1946, we just wanted them gone. In Normandy, several Tigers that had been knocked out during the 1944 campaign remained where they fell. Local communities faced decisions about what to do with them. Some were buried by local authorities as obstacles were cleared from roads and fields. Farmers complained that abandoned tanks interfered with agricultural work and contaminated soil with leaked fluids. Others were dragged to collection points and scrapped. The French army briefly considered retaining some German armor for their own use. France was rebuilding its military and lacked modern equipment, but the logistical challenges of maintaining Tigers, combined with their enormous fuel consumption, made this impractical. The Soviets took a different approach in their occupation zones. While they destroyed many Tigers, they also preserved significant numbers for study and display. Trophy parks were established at military facilities where captured German equipment was maintained as evidence of Soviet victory. These installations served both military education and propaganda purposes. Museums in Moscow and Leningrad received examples for public exhibition. Soviet citizens could view Tigers and other captured equipment while reading plaques that described Soviet triumph over fascist technology. The message was clear. Soviet courage and sacrifice had defeated the enemy's best weapons. Some Tigers were restored to running condition specifically for propaganda films and military parades. Soviet filmmakers used captured German equipment in war movies throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Audiences watching Soviet war films often saw real Tigers rather than mock-ups, though these running examples were rare exceptions rather than the rule. Economic factors accelerated destruction across all occupation zones. Post-war Europe faced severe metal shortages. The thousands of tons of steel, copper, and other materials locked in abandoned German armor represented valuable resources for reconstruction. Governments prioritized economic recovery over historical preservation. Scrap dealers paid top prices for armor plate that could be melted down and repurposed into civilian products. For many communities recovering from war, the arrival of scrap dealers to dismantle nearby Tigers provided employment and income during desperate times. Workers cut apart tanks that had terrorized their neighborhoods months earlier, finding grim satisfaction in reducing them to scrap. The metal that had protected German soldiers now became raw material for rebuilding homes, factories, and infrastructure. Environmental considerations also played a role. Abandoned Tigers leaked fuel, oil, and other fluids that contaminated soil and water. Local authorities wanted them removed from farmland, forests, and waterways. Health officials worried about chemicals seeping into groundwater or agricultural areas. In some cases, Tigers that had been driven into rivers or lakes during combat were left in place, considered too difficult or expensive to recover. Salvage operations were complex and dangerous. Many of these underwater wrecks remain today, occasionally discovered by divers or revealed during droughts when water levels drop. One such Tiger was discovered in 2000 in the Vistula River near Warsaw. Polish divers exploring the riverbed found a Tiger II that had crashed through ice during the retreat from Poland in January 1940. The tank sat in 40 feet of cold, murky water, preserved by the anaerobic conditions. Divers who entered the vehicle found the crew's personal effects still inside: letters from home, photographs, a harmonica. The tank remains underwater today, too expensive to recover, but documented as an underwater memorial. Another Tiger was found in a swamp near St. Petersburg in Russia in 2000. This Tiger eye had been abandoned during the retreat from Leningrad in 1944. Decades of peat accumulation had buried and preserved it. Russian historians worked with veterans to confirm its identity from unit markings. Recovery took weeks, using specialized equipment to lift the tank from the swamp without damaging it. Today, it sits in the Kubinka Museum, one of the few examples recovered from battlefield conditions. By 1948, the vast majority of tigers had ceased to exist. Battlefield wrecks had been scrapped or buried, depot stocks had been destroyed. The handful preserved in museums or testing facilities represented almost all that remained of the 1,000 tanks produced. The speed and thoroughness of this elimination reflected Allied determination to permanently dismantle Germany's military capability. Unlike aircraft, which could potentially be preserved in storage or converted to civilian use, Tigers had no peaceful application. They were purpose-built weapons of war designed to destroy other tanks and kill enemy soldiers. In the post-war world, there was no place for them outside of museums and testing grounds. The systematic destruction seemed logical and necessary at the time. It was only decades later that historians and enthusiasts realized what had been lost. While most tigers were destroyed, a small number found their way into long-term preservation. These survivors offer insights into how the tank's legend grew even as the machines themselves disappeared. Each surviving example represents not just a single tank, but an entire chapter of military history that nearly vanished completely. France retained several captured tigers for evaluation and training. The French approach to preservation was pragmatic, but ultimately more far-sighted than many Allied nations. At Saumur, the Cavalry Museum and Tank School recognized early that German armor represented valuable historical and educational resources. Commandant Pierre Maybach, who directed the Saumur Tank School in the late 1940s, made the decision to preserve multiple tigers rather than scrapping them. In a 1952 letter to the French Ministry of Defense, he wrote, "These machines are not merely defeated enemy equipment. They represent a significant chapter in the evolution of armored warfare. Future officers must understand not just how we defeated them, but why they were formidable. To destroy them completely would be to erase important lessons." The Saumur Tiger. I was used extensively for training throughout the 1950s. French instructors demonstrated German engineering to students, showing the precision, manufacturing, and sophisticated systems that made Tigers effective. French engineers studied the 88mm gun, hoping to incorporate lessons into their own tank destroyer and anti-tank gun designs. French maintenance crews developed expertise in keeping the Tiger operational despite the lack of spare parts. They fabricated components when originals wore out, documented maintenance procedures, and shared information with other museums attempting to preserve Tigers. This early preservation work proved crucial decades later when a restoration became a priority. By the early 1960s, maintenance challenges and parts shortages forced France to retire the Tiger from active use at the tank school. But rather than scrapping it, the tank entered the Saumur Museum collection. Today, the Saumur Tiger remains one of the most complete and well-preserved examples accessible to the public, housed in a museum that attracts armor enthusiasts from around the world. France also preserved a Tiger II, captured during the Battle of France in 1944. This King Tiger, found abandoned near the German border, showed battle damage but remained structurally intact. French engineers studied it extensively, particularly interested in the relationship between armor thickness and weight. The Tiger II's 70-ton mass created mobility problems that informed French decisions about their own heavy tank programs. The French preservation efforts, while modest compared to Soviet collections, ensured that Western Europe retained accessible examples of both Tiger variants. When German museums later sought to display Tigers, they often borrowed expertise and documentation from Saumur, which had maintained institutional knowledge about Tiger preservation when others had not. Britain kept multiple Tigers for museum purposes and continued testing. Tiger 131 at Bovington became one of the most famous surviving Tigers. Initially preserved for training purposes, it later entered the Tank Museum's collection. The museum recognized early that preservation meant more than simply storing inactive vehicles. In the 1990s, museum staff undertook an ambitious restoration project bringing Tiger 131 to running condition. The project took several years and required fabricating parts that no longer existed. Engineers used original technical drawings, consulted with surviving German veterans who had maintained Tigers during the war, and developed expertise in the Maybach HL230 engine and the Tiger's complex transmission. Kevin Wheatcroft, a British businessman and military vehicle collector who supported the restoration, later said, "When I first heard about the project, I thought it was impossible. But watching that Tiger move under its own power again was one of the most extraordinary moments of my life. It's not about glorifying war. It's about preserving a piece of history that nearly disappeared." Today, Tiger 131 runs occasionally at the Bovington Tank Museum during special events. When it does, thousands of people attend to witness history in motion. The sound of the Maybach engine roaring to life, the sight of the 57-ton machine maneuvering with surprising agility, and the knowledge that this is the only operational Tiger Eye in the world create an emotional experience that photographs and videos cannot replicate. British technical schools used Tigers as teaching aids well into the 1950s, allowing students to study German engineering firsthand. When these educational uses ended, several examples entered museum collections rather than being scrapped. British preservation instincts, combined with the Tank Museum's early recognition of historical value, saved more examples than might otherwise have survived. The Soviet Union maintained the largest collection of preserved Tigers. Museums across the Soviet bloc received examples, from Moscow to Warsaw to Prague. Some were restored and displayed with combat damage visible, illustrating Soviet triumph over German technology. Others were kept in storage facilities and occasionally brought out for military demonstrations or historical events. The Kubinka Tank Museum became the primary repository for German armor in Soviet custody. Today, Kubinka houses multiple Tiger variants, including rare late production examples and experimental modifications that Western researchers couldn't access during the Cold War. These collections became invaluable resources for historians after the Soviet Union collapsed and Western scholars gained access. Soviet access to multiple examples allowed for more comprehensive study than Western allies could conduct. Engineers could compare early and late production tigers, documenting how German designs evolved in response to combat experience. They could examine different factories' manufacturing approaches and identify which components were most prone to failure. No country attempted to use tigers operationally after the war. Their mechanical complexity, fuel consumption, and parts requirements made them impractical for any military force to maintain. Unlike the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter or Junkers Ju-fitted transport aircraft, which saw limited foreign service, Tigers were too specialized and too resource-intensive to justify keeping operational. However, the Tiger's reputation ensured that scrapping slowed as historical awareness grew. By the 1960s, military historians and museum curators recognized that very few examples had survived. Efforts began to locate battlefield wrecks and recover tanks before they were lost completely. Several Tigers were pulled from swamps, forests, and fields across Eastern Europe in the 1960s and 1970s. Many were incomplete or badly damaged, but even partial hulls had historical value. Recovery operations were expensive and complex. Organizations like the Bovington Tank Museum invested significant resources in preservation efforts. The restoration of Tigers became a specialized field requiring metallurgical knowledge, historical research, and mechanical expertise. Museums invested years in bringing their Tigers to displayable condition. The Bovington project to restore Tigers to running condition took years of effort and required fabricating parts that no longer existed, using original technical drawings and careful reverse engineering. Today, only a handful of complete Tigers exist worldwide. Tiger 131 at Bovington is the only example capable of movement, though it runs rarely to preserve the irreplaceable machine. Approximately 6 to 8 other Tiger sit in museums across Russia, France, Germany, Britain, and the United States. Each represents not just a single tank, but the entire production run of a weapon that defined armored warfare. Several Tiger II examples also survive, including the famous King Tiger at L'Église in Belgium. This tank was abandoned by its crew during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and remained in the village as a memorial. Locals preserved it, recognizing its historical significance long before museums became interested. The L'Église Tiger II has its own remarkable story. In December 1944, Kampfgruppe Piper, an SS armored battle group spearheading Germany's Ardennes offensive, pushed deep into American lines. Tiger II No. 213 was part of this force. When the offensive stalled and German units retreated, this Tiger ran out of fuel in L'Église. The crew attempted to destroy it, but the demolition charge only partially detonated. The turret was damaged, but the tank remained largely intact. Local residents initially wanted the tank removed, but as years passed and veterans began visiting the site, the community recognized the Tiger as a historical artifact. Rather than scrapping it, they preserved it as a memorial to the battle. Today, it stands as a monument to the desperate fighting that characterized the war's final winter, protected by the community and visited by thousands annually. Other Tiger IIs sit at Kubinka, Fort Benning, and various European museums. The Soviet collection includes rare variants and late production examples that offer insights into German engineering evolution. American collections provide Western researchers access to examples they can study firsthand. The scarcity of surviving tigers has made them objects of intense historical interest. Each example is studied, photographed, and measured by researchers hoping to understand details lost when the majority were destroyed. Rare components, from periscopes to radios to ammunition racks, are documented whenever discovered. Museums carefully preserve every detail, knowing that replacement parts don't exist and never will. The few tigers that remain have become priceless artifacts. Their value is immeasurable in historical terms. Insurance companies struggle to assess worth for machines that are literally irreplaceable. When Tiger 131 runs at Bovington, museum staff hold their breath, knowing that mechanical failure could end the only operational example's running career permanently. What survived the immediate post-war destruction phase was essentially random. Tanks that happened to be in the right place, captured by forces inclined to preserve them, or simply overlooked during the rush to scrap everything else, were saved. Geography played a role. Tigers captured in areas that became major military museums had better survival chances than those in remote locations. Individual decisions mattered too. Officers like Commandant Maybach at Saumur, who recognized historical value, sometimes intervened to save specific tanks. Local communities like L'Église, that chose preservation over scrapping money, made decisions that resonated across decades. Museum curators who argued for funding preservation projects when others wanted to discard outdated equipment shaped what survived. Klaus Hartmann, the German tank commander who chose not to destroy his Tiger, learned decades later that his machine had been preserved at Aberdeen before eventually being scrapped. In his 1980s interview, he said, "I often wondered what happened to her. Part of me hoped she survived. Part of me knew they probably destroyed her anyway. War leaves nothing intact, not even the tools we use to wage it." The systematic elimination of the 1940s means that what exists today represents less than 1% of all tigers produced. We study fragments of a legend that grew larger as the machines themselves disappeared. Every surviving tiger carries the weight of hundreds that didn't make it, serving as a memorial to all of them. The story of tigers after 1945 is ultimately one of rapid destruction, followed by slow recognition of what had been lost. In their eagerness to dismantle German military power and recover scarce materials, the Allies eliminated most examples of what would become history's most studied and mythologized tank. By the time historians and museums sought to preserve tigers, very few remained to save. The machines that had terrorized Allied tank crews and dominated battlefields from North Africa to the Eastern Front had been reduced to a handful of museum pieces scattered across the world. The lessons learned from studying tigers influenced tank development for decades. American designers incorporated heavier armor and more powerful guns into Cold War-era tanks like the M1 and M60. British engineers applied knowledge from Tiger evaluation to the successful Centurion design. Soviet designers used insights from captured Tigers to improve their heavy tank programs. The influence extended beyond specific technical features to broader doctrinal questions about the role of heavy armor in modern warfare. But the physical machines themselves, the actual Tigers that fought in World War II, mostly vanished within 3 years of the war's end. What started as approximately tanks in May 1940 was reduced to perhaps 10 to 12 complete survivors by 1950. The elimination was systematic, thorough, and ultimately regrettable. Modern efforts to locate tigers continue. Occasionally, a wreck is discovered in a forest or pulled from a riverbed. Each find generates significant interest among historians and military enthusiasts, even if the tank is too damaged for restoration. These discoveries remind us how quickly even the most formidable machines can vanish, and how the post-war world reshaped not just the legacy of German armor, but the physical evidence of its existence. The underwater tigers that remain in rivers and lakes serve as time capsules. Divers who locate them document their condition, noting serial numbers, equipment configurations, and damage patterns. In some cases, these wrecks provide information unavailable from surviving museum examples. They show tigers as they were in combat, not as they were restored for display. In 1999, a tiger was discovered in the Dnieper River in Ukraine. Soviet forces had pushed it off a bridge during the retreat in 1940. It sat in 25 feet of water for 56 years. When divers entered the fighting compartment, they found the crew's personal effects remarkably preserved. A leather wallet with photographs, a pocket watch stopped at 3 cents, and letters that told the story of men far from home fighting a war they would not survive. The tank remains underwater, a memorial to both the machine and the men who fought in it. The scarcity has created an interesting dynamic. Tiger mythology has grown inversely to tiger availability. As the tanks became rarer, their legend expanded. Popular culture seized upon tigers as symbols of German military prowess. Films, books, video games, and documentaries feature tigers prominently, often exaggerating their capabilities and battlefield presence. This mythologization sometimes obscures historical reality. Tigers were formidable, but not invincible. They suffered from mechanical unreliability, consumed enormous resources, and were produced in relatively small numbers compared to Allied tanks. German heavy tank battalions often had more tigers broken down than operational. Logistics crews struggled to keep them supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. But the legend persists because tigers represented a type of military excellence that fascinates people. Sophisticated engineering, devastating firepower, and a reputation earned through genuine battlefield superiority. The fact that so few survived makes them more compelling, not less. Scarcity enhances mystique. The surviving examples at museums like Bovington, Kubinka, Saumur, Fort Benning, and L'Église have become pilgrimage sites for military history enthusiasts. Visitors travel thousands of miles to see actual tigers, to touch the armor that defeated Allied shells, to peer through the gun sights that German gunners used, to understand the machines that defined armored warfare in their era. When Tiger 131 runs at Bovington, the event draws crowds of thousands. People stand in silence as the Maybach engine roars to life, watching the massive tank maneuver with surprising grace. For a few minutes, history comes alive. The ground trembles under the tigers because the exhaust creates clouds of smoke. The sound is visceral, a deep, powerful roar that photographers' cameras cannot fully capture. Then the engine shuts down, and the tiger returns to static display, too valuable to risk with extended operation. The irony is profound. The Allies destroyed tigers to eliminate a threat and recover resources. But in doing so, they created a different kind of scarcity, historical rather than military. What they saw as obsolete enemy equipment is now recognized as irreplaceable heritage. The thorough destruction that seemed necessary in 1940 looks regrettable through the lens of historical preservation in 2040. We can't undo those decisions. The tigers that were scrapped or blown up can't be recovered, but we can learn from them. The fate of tigers after World War II illustrates the tension between immediate practical needs and long-term historical value. It reminds us that what seems obsolete or threatening today might be invaluable tomorrow. The handful of tigers that survived did so through luck, foresight, and sometimes random chance. They exist as monuments, not just to German engineering or Allied victory, but to the importance of preserving material history, even when doing so seems impractical. Every time someone visits Tiger 131 or studies the examples at Kubinka, they benefit from decisions made decades ago by individuals who chose preservation over destruction. Colonel Carver, reflecting in his later years as Field Marshal Lord Carver, said, "We studied tigers to defeat them. We destroyed tigers to prevent their use, but perhaps we should have saved more to teach future generations. The best memorial to those who fought and died is not to pretend their weapons didn't exist, but to preserve them so we never forget what war demands and what it costs." The tiger's fate reminds us that military history isn't just about battles and tactics. It's also about what happens to the weapons after the fighting stops, and how decisions made in the immediate aftermath of war echo across generations. The systematic destruction of tigers seemed logical at the time. Only later did we realize what we had lost. And that's the final lesson from the tiger story. After 1940, sometimes the real victory isn't destroying your enemy's weapons. Sometimes it's preserving them so future generations can learn from them. The dozen tigers that survive today serve as teachers more valuable than they ever were as weapons. They teach us about engineering, about warfare, about the cost of conflict, and about the sometimes painful choices involved in deciding what deserves to survive. When museum visitors stand before a tiger today, they're not just looking at a tank. They're looking at a physical connection to history, to the men who built it, crewed it, fought it, captured it, studied it, and ultimately preserved it. They're looking at one of the few survivors of a systematic elimination that reduced 1,037 machines to fewer than 10 in just 3 years. The tiger story after 1940 isn't really about tanks at all. It's about how we choose to remember history. It's about the tension between destroying the past and learning from it. It's about individuals who made choices that seemed small at the time, but proved monumental across decades. Klaus Hartmann chose not to destroy his tiger. Commandant Maillard chose to preserve rather than scrap. The villages of L'Église chose memorial over money. Museum curators chose restoration over retirement. Each decision, made by individuals at specific moments, determined whether pieces of history survived or vanished. Today, when Tiger 131's engine starts at Bovington, It's not glorifying war. It's honoring preservation. It's celebrating the people who, amid destruction and chaos, chose to save something for the future. It's reminding us that history isn't just written in books. Sometimes it's preserved in metal, maintained by dedication, and shared through the rumble of a Maybach engine that refuses to be forgotten. The Tigers are gone, but the handful that remain tell a story more important than any battle they fought. The story of what we choose to remember and why that choice matters. If you found this exploration of the Tiger's afterlife compelling, consider exploring what happened to other legendary weapons after their wars ended. The story of preservation versus destruction repeats across military history, each time teaching us something new about how societies process conflict and honor memory. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe for more stories about what happened after the battles ended and why those stories matter as much as the battles themselves.